Hi, welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter and I'll be your host for today's show. America at its Best is a time for you to sit back and see how your partnership with State Policy Network is changing lives across our country. And that's so important right now. It's been a tough year, for sure. It's been especially tough for those Americans who are out of work right now. We talk about the economy not being great. We talk about unemployment being high. But the truth is, this is about people. This is about parents who right now are having to choose between going into work or staying home to get their 6 or 7-year-old signed up to their virtual school web link. It's about people who have to shut down their restaurants, perhaps your favorite restaurant, because of COVID restrictions. It's about so much more than that. People are getting furloughed, they're out of work. These are tough times. Here's the good news. You're changing all of that through your partnership with SPN and this network. Today, we're going to be talking about the economy. We'll be hearing from Michael Lucci, who is SPN's economic policy expert, and also from Justin Owen, who's the CEO of the Beacon Center in Tennessee. They're going to tell us how they have ideas to reignite this economy, and it's already starting to show results. But first, before we talk with them, Tracy Sharp was unable to join us today, but she really wanted to give you guys a briefing on her recent conversation with Vice President Pence. They talked about a number of issues, and the economy was certainly one of them. Since she couldn't be here, she recorded a video that she asked me to share with you. So let's take a look at what Tracy had to say, and I'll be right back.
Last month, I was invited to meet with Vice President Pence in his ceremonial office next to the White House. The Vice President invited a group of 6 of us for what he called a listening session. And indeed, that's what it turned out to be. This was a refreshing approach and an acknowledgement that those in the room carried valuable intel that they wanted to hear about. For SPN's part, being there along with Tim Phillips with Americans for Prosperity was a recognition that feedback and intel from the states matters, especially from those like us on the ground and closer to the action. I brought up the importance of driving K-12 education reforms right now, since so many parents and children are struggling, and that closing schools hurts vulnerable populations more acutely, like single mothers. I thank Pence for supporting school choice and that this network is driving more reforms ahead. Pence leaned forward and said that school choice, giving parents more options, got the biggest applause at his Fort McHenry speech, and he brought that up at last Wednesday's debate as well. I replied that the power of personal agency looms large right now. People need some sort of feeling of empowerment after being cooped up and loaded down with government mandates, and school choice provides some of that for them and their children. Tim Phillips of AFP said his door-knocking teams across the country are seeing the top issues as economic recovery, healthcare reform, and K-12. Since those 3 issues happen to be our top 3 issues in the network, this was a great opportunity for me to emphasize holding firm against state bailouts, and that there were details in the packets I gave him and his staff to back up how too much federal help is no help at all. And in fact, it goes beyond diminishing returns. It can be damaging. Hurricane Katrina and other emergencies have taught us that it creates dependency and higher spending habits that are hard to dial back after the emergency is passed. I also brought up our work to make the temporary COVID-related healthcare reforms permanent, such as telemedicine. All these issues are being launched and legislated at the state level, where state solutions are leading to national impact. Funny side story, the meeting was winding down and we were in fact over time, but Pence wanted to show us the desk in his office. It used to be the president's desk back in the day, including Teddy Roosevelt's, before it became the vice president's desk. He opened the middle drawer, which was empty, to show us how several vice presidents had carved their names in it. Pence said, it appears that Joe Biden used a wood-burning pen to carve his name, and everybody laughed. Biden's name was quite prominent in the wood on the bottom of the drawer. Overall, it was a productive meeting with the vice president and his top staff. And by the way, it was my first time being on a plane since March. It was worth the trip. Thank you to our supporters who have fueled the great changes going on in the states through this network. I had no shortage of examples of impact and breakthroughs to report to the vice president. And as I mentioned, I was able to leave him with packets of info for future reference. So thank you again for all you do to support this network, where state solutions are leading to national impact. Thank you.
And that's our message from Tracy. I do want to make sure you guys are aware that SPN staff and my colleagues are continuing to have conversations frequently with the Vice President's office and the administration, key people in the administration. And it's always centered around how the federal government can return power to the states. So thank you for all you've done to make that possible. Now, before we welcome our first guest, I just want to remind you to please enter any questions you've got as we go in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We will have Q&A after we hear from both of our guests. Our first guest is Michael Lucci, who is our economic policy expert, and he also leads our economic recovery working group, which basically is the best and brightest minds on the economy from the state voices coming through and trying to figure out how we get through this mess that we're in today. Michael also had a baby about a week ago. So Michael, welcome to the show. And how's the baby? How are you guys doing?
She's doing really well. She's sleeping right now, and hopefully it stays that way for the next hour.
Okay, well, if she wakes up, I guess we'll all get a treat and we'll get to see her. So,
Absolutely.
All right, Michael, let's dive right in, okay? You know, first of all, what's the difference truly in terms of economic health of states that opened up in a sensible way versus states that just stayed locked down? I mean, have we seen a whole lot of difference?
Yes, we're seeing it all over the country. So let me give you one example between New York and Florida, which took very different policy directions on a number of issues, in particular economic issues. They're about the same size in terms of population, but right now, as of today, Florida has recovered 650,000 more jobs than New York has up to this point. To give you a sense of that scale, that's like all of the jobs in the state of West Virginia or all of the jobs in the state of New Hampshire. That's how far ahead Florida is compared to New York. You see the same comparison of Michigan versus its southern neighbors of Indiana and Ohio, Arizona and California, North Carolina and Georgia. You see these similarly situated states producing very different outcomes, and it's directly tied to the policies that those governors and to some extent those legislatures enact.
Wow. Okay, so what do you and the SPN working group feel are solutions to start to get the economy going again, especially in these states where things are really bad?
Well, it's important at this point to stop having these blanket economic lockdowns, which have been very harmful. There have been a lot of economic studies that have pointed to the fact that these have been main drivers of unemployment and economic losses in the states. But then in terms of state-specific recovery policies, we're looking to make sure that the lawsuit environment, the tax code, and the regulatory or red tape environment don't stand in the way of economic success. So all states can improve on this area of having lawsuit protections for businesses that are, just opening in good faith, making sure that tax code doesn't stand in the way of entrepreneurs and new businesses and new investors, and making sure that the red tape, which is like a thicket, like handcuffs in many of these states, doesn't stop people from transitioning into a new job or doesn't stop businesses from opening in new ways.
So those are all sensible reforms that the states can enact when the legislatures come back together in 2021, it sounds like. I want to talk more about that, but first, let's dive into what I think is on everybody's mind. You heard Tracy say that sometimes too much federal help is no help at all. Let's talk about the federal bailouts. Does SPN have a lane in this? And what does success look like in your mind?
Success looks like we don't wipe away the mistakes of decades that some of these profligate and poorly managed states have gotten themselves into. And success looks like maintaining competition between the states to manage themselves well, to have competitive economies, and to grow well. We're seeing that start to play out, but if there's a broad scale federal bailout of the states, then we're not going to see the discipline. We're not going to see the rewards to the well-managed states and the discipline and restructuring that's needed in the poorly managed states. So right now, we are seeing that difference in economic recovery between the states. But if there's a broad scale bailout, that's going to diminish a lot. SPN has been actually very effective on this front. Tracy talked about briefing Vice President Pence. We've repeatedly briefed the president's top policy advisor for domestic policy, who's actually an alum of the SPN network. And we've also, I'll tell you one story. Jennifer Butler, who's our lead on federal issues, was on a call with Larry Kudlow. And Kudlow was asking the thoughts of a whole bunch of groups. And all these groups want more money, $500 billion, $1 trillion. Jennifer presented the analysis that we produced with all the state think tanks saying what the real fiscal gap was and what states can do to solve the problem themselves. And Larry pointed out, that's the kind of detailed walkthrough that I'm looking for when we have this conversation. So just in that one call, we were able to move the conversation in a more realistic and reasonable place that's helped govern how this conversation goes going forward.
That's good. And so what would you say then, knowing that these conversations are happening, we do have the ear of powerful people within the administration, but politically things are hot and it's an odd time to be having these conversations. So what do you actually think is going to be the outcome of this? And considering what's politically possible, what does success look like to you?
What we would want to see is if there's going to be more money from the federal government to the states, that money not be greater than the actual fiscal gap that states have sustained through this recession. So there has been a decline in revenue that states have experienced. Many states are able to manage this on their own. Probably over half of states are able to manage this on their own. But if there is the necessity of more federal money, and if that's a bipartisan issue, making sure that it is below, say, the $150 to $200 billion range, which represents the real gap that states face, whereas the conversation has been $1 trillion, $700 billion, $600 billion. That's just not realistic. That's not what states are facing. And the real purpose of that is to bail out blue states that have been mismanaged for decades.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Now let's move on to talk about the state specifically. One of my favorite things about State Policy Network is that we find ways to make things better again, no matter what the federal government does or doesn't do. And the economy is no exception. So you mentioned things like tort reform, tax reform, and getting rid of bureaucratic red tape. Help me understand a little bit more how these three kinds of reforms can actually turn the tide here. Walk us through success and a little more in this plan.
Well, on tort, Justin is going to talk in more detail about that because he really helped lead a great success in Tennessee, and Buckeye led great success in Ohio. But what tort protection means is protecting businesses that operate in good faith, they're following health guidelines, so that they don't get sued back into closure right after they've reopened. So tort protection is just common sense lawsuit protection so that businesses don't get sued back into closure. On tax reform, we could cite President Obama himself and some of his top economic advisors who said you shouldn't raise taxes in a recession. So the first and most important objective here is to resist tax increases that are on the docket in Illinois, in California. Actually, New Jersey just enacted a millionaire's tax increase, but resisting tax increases that are being considered in a number of states, but having good, sensible tax relief and tax reform so that businesses are able to invest, and businesses that have a lot of losses are able to carry through even though they had a really bad year. On red tape, this is where you really see the handcuffs on entrepreneurs, on businesses, on workers who are trying to move into new industries. And this is a real bread and butter issue where a lot of ideas that have been promulgated across SPN are now very timely. Issues related to occupational licensing, the treatment of new types of industries. There's a great opportunity to enact policies to lock in good policy that will lead to greater economic success if those states take the right path.
So Michael, SPAN's model is always state solutions that lead to national impact. And we have seen time and time again that if you can get a good policy passed in one state and spread to another and another and another, eventually it makes its way across the map and becomes the new normal. So on something like this, how is that going to work? Do you have the target states? Do you know how many there are? What's the kind of broader goal you're talking about in the short term?
We have 10 target states, and we are targeting having 20 reforms total passed across those 10 states. However, there are states that are outside of our target group that we're feeding individual reforms to, and they're running with those individual reforms. So, for example, the state of Arizona is not one of our particular target states this year, but we've already fed 2 specific tax reforms into the Arizona governor's office. For our target states, it's a more intensive look at those tort, tax, and red tape issues in order to produce a recovery. And what we're shooting for is we want states to recover all the jobs that they lost during this recession and get their unemployment rates back below 5%. The more pro-growth policies they enact, the faster that will happen. And again, we're already seeing that play out. There are some states that aren't too far from recovering all the jobs that they lost. There are other states where it's going to take years because they're making, pretty much every mistake that they can. So that's our goal for those target states, is that they lead the way, they get people back to work in their states, and then either people move into their state because they have a better economy, or their competitor states have to follow some of the same pathways so that they could have job creation in their state too.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, last question. You shared a few great stories about good and bad things that are happening in the states. We're about to hear from Justin. Is there anything that pops out in your mind that you want to leave us with in terms of a story of success, something good that you've seen happen in this vein in a state?
So Justin will talk about the lawsuit reforms, and there have been successes in Tennessee, in Ohio, in Kansas, in Oklahoma, and other states. One of the areas where we're very hopeful is reforming occupational licensing. There's a number of parts to that, but I'll just tell you about one, which is allowing people to move between states and allowing their license to transfer. We saw Arizona enact that reform in 2019. In 2020, state legislatures have really been restricted. They haven't been together that much, and when they had, they've only dealt with targeted issues. But already in 2020, Missouri actually passed the same type of licensing reform to allow people to move in and out of states, maintaining their license across state borders. But we saw dozens of other states already introduce such legislation, and we're very hopeful that in 2021, during the legislative session, a lot of states will enact that good policy. That's one example of a really meaningful policy that will affect tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of workers who are moving across borders to find an opportunity.
Thanks, Michael. That's a great example of how we can remove some barriers so that people can work anywhere. And that reminds me, our colleague Kathleen O'Hearn always tells the story, and she told us on the show a few months ago, of that picture of the Georgia doctors on an airplane going to help in New York when COVID was at its peak. And they were able to do that because the licensing laws were lifted. So it's a great example of another way we can get people back to work quickly. We will hear from Michael again in a few minutes. If you have a question for Michael, reminder, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So Michael mentioned that Justin Owen, who is the CEO of the Beacon Center in Tennessee, has a few good stories to share with us, mostly around tort reform. So Justin, I'm giving you a big opening here, but before we get there, spoiler, tell us, what do you think, what have you found is the biggest pain point for business owners in Tennessee?
Well, one of the things we did very early on in the process was to position ourselves to listen to and be a champion for those small businesses and entrepreneurs. They really didn't have a voice. They were being shut down. Many were still just trying to keep their business afloat. They were hit so hard by the pandemic and the government's response. And so we really want to position Tennessee to lead on our recovery by listening to them. And what we heard was that even though many could be open, excuse me, once we started to reopen our state, they still were afraid to do so because of frivolous lawsuits. This was the most frequent thing we heard from them in terms of barriers to reopening. And so we worked very hard to effectively be a translator between them and the governor and them and other policymakers to show that this has to be addressed. Otherwise, we're not going to have the full economic recovery as soon as we hope to. Can
you share a story with us about real people you were talking with and how how they were struggling?
Yeah, so one small retail owner called me during this process and asked and said, well, now that we can be open, what's expected of me? Do I have to hire someone to stand at the door and check everybody's temperature and throw face masks at them? What is my legal liability for being open? It's not, am I going to get fined by the government? It was a lawsuit that he was afraid of. And honestly, without liability reform, my answer was, who knows? Because the courts are ultimately going to decide that if you don't have laws on the books that address such an unprecedented situation. And so that led us to know that these businesses are afraid of being slapped with multi-million-dollar lawsuits. We've got to do something about that so that they can safely reopen.
Now, Justin, this, of course, is not a problem that's unique to Tennessee. I imagine this is happening all over the country. So from your view, how did politicians in Washington, D.C. handle this? Were they able to muddle through and find a solution?
Surprisingly, no. This is the typical thing we see in Washington these days, right? You get a lot of talk and a little action. To his credit, Leader McConnell has made it a huge priority to enact business liability reform, has said every time there's a relief package discussion, this is foremost, this is of utmost importance, but nothing's gotten done. And so these businesses who are trying to reopen are languishing with uncertainty. And ultimately, you have to rely on the states to step in and provide those protections for businesses in those states, because Washington, even if they do act, they're certainly not acting soon enough.
So how did Beacon offer those kinds of protections? Give us the story.
Early on, we started working with our State Chamber of Commerce and NFIB, who really led the coalition building efforts, which wound up being over 100 different associations and organizations, because ultimately we wanted to provide these legal protections, not just to businesses, but hospitals, schools. You want to talk about schools reopening. This was a big hurdle for them. Nonprofits, all kinds of entities were faced with this. And so we built a coalition in partnership with those organizations, and then really worked to get the governor comfortable with what's the path forward? How do we actually solve this problem without going too far and trying to enact real broad-based tort reforms, but also doing it in a way that's going to matter. And then we worked to get this passed in the legislature. The governor called a special session in August to address this issue, and we were very vocal and involved in advocating to get this across the finish line.
And do the business owners you've been talking with this whole time now feel protected and it's safe to open?
They do, because they don't feel like they're going to be threatened with frivolous lawsuits. And so they can be reasonable in their approach to reopening and focus on other things like getting their staff back and those kinds of things that should be front of mind for them. In addition to that, the other benefit to this too is that you can still be accountable if you're grossly negligent. We didn't just say anybody and everybody can open and ignore the laws. So for example, let's say you run a restaurant and one of your servers calls you and says, I just tested positive for COVID. I'm sick. I'm really sick. And you say, well, too bad. I need you to come to work. And by the way, you can't wear a mask while you're at work. Well, that maybe is taking it a step too far. So ultimately, the restrictions or the liability protections we put in place were reasonable and balanced to allow for the safe reopening of businesses while still holding accountable those who are grossly negligent, which is ultimately the legal standard that the new law set.
Okay, so you know, because you're not new to this, that at SPN and throughout this network, we're all about spreading good ideas across the states. So have you heard from your colleagues or talked with them, CEOs of think tanks and organizations in other states who have seen what you've been able to accomplish in Tennessee and say, sign me up, I'm going to try this in my state?
We have. I've talked to several fellow CEOs across the state, and our team has talked to other policy teams across the country. And that's the great thing about SPN and our network, is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you find an approach that works, you can spread that like wildfire across the country. And several states have now enacted this because they've seen that it is such a high priority for their recovery. And so the ability to share notes and say, here, what is the best policy solution to this is very important, but so are the logistical challenges. A lot of the things that you face in terms of opposition or just questions from policymakers tend to be similar from state to state. So the ability to talk through that before it happens and be prepared for that is a real benefit to being part of this network.
Thanks, Justin. Well, we'll keep an eye on it and report back to our viewers as this continues to spread. Last question before we move into Q&A from the audience. Can you just leave us with a little more information on what else Beacon is doing to help get people back to work? Kind of what's next?
Well, Michael mentioned the licensing issue is very important. Our governor's office actually reached out and said, what are the big, bold things we can do and propose to jumpstart our economic recovery? Much of that centers around eliminating these licensing and other restrictions and this red tape that makes it hard for people to get back to work. And so we're very involved in that. Another thing that we're really trying to do is all of those regulations that were suspended, let's make as many of those permanent as possible. And this is something that even blue states can do, because even Democratic governors suspended telehealth restrictions on getting telehealth across state lines, allowing people to work in your state when they move from another state with a license. Those are things that even blue states have experienced the benefits from suspending. Why not make those permanent? So I think there are real opportunities to slash a lot of red tape going forward.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Well, now we'll bring Michael back and we'll move into the Q&A portion of the show. As a reminder, the Q&A button is at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and we had a few people submit questions before the show. So let's get started. First question is from our friend, Ed Johnson. Ed, thanks for joining the show. His question is, when do you expect to see policy changes taking effect in the states? What about the states like Michigan and Illinois that are exceptionally awful right now? Michael, let's start with you in terms of how fast do you think some of the good can take hold, especially in blue states? You're on mute, Michael.
We've sensed a lot of states holding to see what the federal government's going to do. Federal government has thus far deferred, and so states are going to have to deal with these economic and fiscal issues themselves. In terms of Michigan, the good news for people in Michigan is that due to a Supreme Court ruling, the state's going to be reopened. The economy is going to be reopened. Supreme Court has decided that the governor has overreached her authority and used essentially an emergency law in an unjustified way. And I will mention that SPN has been very much on offense to push back on the overreach of executive powers in different parts of SPN. For Illinois, I mean, frankly, Illinois is a state that has to learn things the hard way. And Illinois is waiting to see if it can get a big federal bailout. There probably isn't a federal bailout that's big enough for Illinois, but here's something that's important that we are resisting at the federal level. Speaker Pelosi crafted her state bailout policy based on how high the unemployment rate is in each state. So in other words, if you've mismanaged your state more, we're going to send more money to you. And so you have big states like Texas in her model get less money than smaller states do because Texas managed itself well. So that's just one of the many federal issues where we're pushing back. I think ultimately states are going to have to get their house in order if they're not able to get that big federal bailout that they're looking for. And some of the blue states that made a lot of mistakes are going to have to follow the path of more of the pro-growth states.
Justin, anything to add?
If you're not happy with what your state's doing, Tennessee is open for business. We'll welcome you with open arms.
Nice. Okay. Next question is from Natalie Simon. What successful models have you seen work for COVID recovery, particularly for jurisdictions that rely heavily on tourism and hospitality? Also, what about poor states?
Yeah, I think one thing I'm not sure if there's a really good success model for those with tourism. I know Nashville, for example, here is very heavily reliant on tourism and is an actual example of we're an open state. The state has no restrictions on businesses right now, but as part of that reopening plan, our governor did allow certain local mayors, particularly in the urban areas, more authority over these decisions. And our mayor's just been obstinate. He's refused to really reopen at a reasonable pace. And as of right now, restaurants are still limited to 50% capacity and have to close early and those kinds of things. And it's devastating them. Nashville, in fact, has had the worst economic downturn of any city in the country. We've lost a third of our consumer spending. And that's like 6 points higher than the next city, I think Cleveland. And so this is an example of what not to do. But I think if you do reopen reasonably and responsibly, you're going to start to attract the tourism again. You're going to start to see your economic condition improve. But if you don't, even in a state like Tennessee, where we're open, the city of Nashville continues to struggle because of its own bad policy decisions.
Michael, anything to add, especially on the question about poor states, and their struggle to reopen?
Yeah, so on the states that are reliant on one industry, it's really important not to have these lockdowns. The worst economic recovery is also in one of the poorer states, which is Hawaii. They are down 1 in 6 jobs right now. So compared to where they were at the beginning of the year, they're down 1 in 6 jobs right now. Nobody's close to that. Now, a big part of that is because they're so reliant on tourism, but another part of that is they've been extremely restrictive on what visitors can do, how long they have to quarantine, to the extent that huge sectors of their economy are just off the radar right now. So that's a model of what not to do. Someone in Hawaii recently said, we're all getting poor because of this. On the other side, there are states like Florida. It's a diversified economy, but they are very reliant on tourism too. But they've made sure to take a thoughtful approach. They've made sure to not shut down industry unnecessarily, and they're going to recover well. They're already recovering pretty well in Florida, even though they are more reliant on some of that travel and tourism. So whether you're a wealthier state or a poorer state, kind of the broad pro-growth solutions and being very careful and thoughtful about blanket shutdown approaches are going to help you succeed.
Michael, the second part of Natalie's question asked about what does reality look like when you think about the lack of consumer confidence? Because it's one thing for a state to open, it's another thing for people to stay home. How does that play into this?
So a big part of the economic shutdown is just because consumers change their habits. They're going to have to get comfortable. We're all going to have to get comfortable with the world that we live in before there's a vaccine, after there's a vaccine. So some of that is out of our control. That's out of the control of policymakers. The sooner the better in terms of health therapies to this coronavirus pandemic. But we've seen this in previous pandemics. People just change their behavior and they need to get comfortable with the health risks that they're taking on before they'll go back to their old spending habits. In the meantime, it's really important, as Justin said in Tennessee, and we're seeing in other states, make sure there are as little handcuffs as possible on those who are either looking to start a new type of business or looking to go back into the market as a consumer, so that what economic opportunities there are, we maximize those, recognizing that some things are out of the control of policymakers.
All right, anything to add, Justin?
Yeah, I'd say that's the way it should be, right? I mean, if consumers aren't quite comfortable yet, then fine, that's part of the reality. But you should know that's the reason people aren't showing up to restaurants, not because of forced closures and limitations imposed by the government.
Yeah, that makes sense. We had a couple of questions, one from Rick Charrier, I might have said your last name wrong, Rick, and another, from Natalie, that were similar in terms of, how do we elevate a meaningful discussion when everything seems so steeped in partisan rhetoric? That combined with Rick's question about we're getting so much misinformation on both sides. Now, Michael, I know SPN has engaged in some polling, and we've been a part of a COVID omnibus poll since March, along with a number of other worldwide organizations to kind of keep an eye on how people are really feeling about this. So I would imagine that we have some messaging on the economy and how to talk with different audiences about this, and that the working group would be using that moving forward. But am I onto something here, or what are your thoughts on how we start this conversation in a more productive way?
Yeah, I mean, we have to recognize that there's a trade-off that policy leaders are making between the public health side and the economic opportunity side. And it's a hard trade-off to make, but we're seeing that going too far in one direction is creating a lot of long-term harm. So one of the products that we're going to elevate, actually, we're going to publish it probably this week, is a recovery jobs tracker across all 50 states. So I mentioned earlier, New York's down 650,000 jobs compared to Florida. We getting that data out there, and SPN think tanks will use that data showing how the 50 states compare, will help elevate the conversation in terms of what is the actual trade-off. So the trade-off states like New York and California are making is they're giving up a lot of economic opportunity, and that has a long-term health, not just on the economy, but people's health as well. So making sure that there's good, solid data showing what's happening across the states will help elevate the conversation, which can get you a little bit out of kind of partisan bickering that is unfortunately too common today.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, one of the things that we were very careful about from the beginning was not to push back too far and recognize that people are concerned, especially early when we didn't know as much as we know even now. There was a tremendous concern, and rightfully so, about public health and a willingness to embrace some of these government intrusion in our lives. And so rather than fully reject that notion, we tried to strike a very positive balance. And one of the things we said over and over and over in the media and hammered on this was that we can protect both lives and livelihoods. And we showed the stories of those businesses who were harmed and brought that human perspective into it, so much so that we helped convince our governor to entirely scrap this essential versus non-essential designation of businesses. And when he did so, when he announced that he was doing it, he literally uttered the words, "We can protect both lives and livelihoods," adopting our exact messaging. And so giving your friendly policymakers the cover and kind of nudge them in the right direction to not go too far themselves one way or the other, I think is helpful and was something that we were very successful at doing.
Good. Now, Michael, you mentioned earlier that there are some groups at SPN who've been really working hard to make sure that the governors don't have unlimited executive powers to say, we're going to shut down the economy with no oversight from the legislature, no check and balance. And you mentioned that the Mackinac Center in Michigan had a great win recently where the courts decided with them that the governor couldn't do that. Paul Farago is asking, how important are the state of emergency orders from last springs in terms of their correlation with depressing states' economic recovery? And do you think that other states are going to end up in court like Mackinac, or do you think that they'll just end up lapsing eventually?
So for the first part of the question, very important. There have been a couple economic studies already. Economists at the University of Chicago looked at Illinois and Iowa's border, and they basically found that the policy orders were accountable for 12% of the depressed economic activity. On the other end of the spectrum, economists at Ohio State and Indiana University found that these shutdown orders were responsible for about 60% of the depressed economic activity. So wherever you end up on that spectrum, it's a big, big part of the economic losses we're sustaining. Even if it's on the low end, that's a lot of economic loss. My intuition is, especially as time goes on, it's getting closer and closer to the higher end of that spectrum. So it's a big part of economic losses. As Justin said, we will fully recognize that a lot of economic loss is because people are changing their habits. People are staying home more, they're not going to the movies, they're not taking vacations. But economic studies are showing that government policies on lockdown are a huge part of the economic losses as well. And then going forward, government policies on clearing out the red tape are going to go a long way to helping states have a faster recovery.
Okay, another question for you guys. We've heard a lot about your plans for Tennessee, Justin, that hopefully can spread across the country, and Michael, what the working group's been focused on. How does this change in terms of if we see a Biden presidency or a Trump presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does influence the types of things that you can do, but we're going to do what we're going to do in Tennessee, regardless of who's president. And in some cases, if we have a split government where we have, a Democrat in the White House and Republicans keep the Senate, that's going to drive more decisions to the local level in a different way than, pro-federalism has driven it with the Republican in the White House. And so I still think states are going to take the lead. I think we'll have to fight a lot harder to preserve those things like right to work in Tennessee. We're in the process of putting that in our state constitution because of the threats that we see against it. And so you might have to change the things you focus on to preserve the good, and to be, a leader as other states kind of follow that federal model with the Democrat in the White House. But at the end of the day, the states are where it's at. I mean, regardless of who's in the White House, who controls Congress, it's imperative that we give more and more authority and decision-making on policy to the states.
Okay, Michael, any additional response?
There's the difference between the opportunity to go on offense and the need to be on defense with respect to federal policy. So if there's another Trump term, we've already used our contacts in the White House and in the Senate to push specific tax reforms that we think would be very timely. Those are, of course, much less likely under a Biden administration. They would probably go the other way on tax reform. So these are tax reforms that could be done at the federal and the state level. If there's a Biden administration, we're probably going to have to really arm up to push back against a broad state bailout that would certainly be at play, because that diminishes, our perspective is federalism is integral to our country. Allowing this laboratory of democracies shows you what works and what doesn't work. And we don't want those successes and failures to be wiped away by a blanket federal bailout of all of the good and bad that's been done at the state level.
Yeah, well, we definitely have our work cut out for us. Thank you, Michael and Justin, for being our guests today and everything you're doing. Thank you for those of you who tuned in, so that we can all rest assured there is more going on than just what you're seeing at the federal level to get our economy back on track. Thank you guys for making that possible. Our next show will be in November. Keep an eye out for the date and the topic. If there's something you're just dying for us to cover because you're really excited about it, please shoot me an email. My email address is painter@spn.org. I'd love to see what you'd like to know more about. Thanks for being here, and I will see you guys again in November. Have a good day.